the death of George Floyd, who was seen around the world with this man begging, for some attention to the violence and the suffering that was inflicted, to him, and this policeman not even taking that in consideration. This man, saying, "I can't breathe," and who died, from that violence, is certainly saying that, we've had enough of this.
What went through your mind? I can hear your voice. What went through your mind when you saw that video of Mr. Floyd?
I think that, there was something, the cruelty. This policeman with his knee on George Floyd's neck, and his colleagues just looking, in other directions and not even listening to the plea of this man dying. It was so atrocious to see, and at the same time, it's only one more other, death on a very long list of African Americans who are assassinated, who are murdered, under police violence, and of course, it's not just an American, issue. I think we come from a long legacy of hatred that we need to acknowledge. A legacy of hatred that came from the time of colonial conquests, based on the ideology of white supremacy, the supremacy of a white race, domination, total dehumanization, and I don't think that we came out of these centuries of mass slavery, conquered peoples who were deemed inferior, indigenous and black peoples. We cannot emerge from that long experience and that long system, unscathed. It's impossible.
And that's what you wrote in your op-ed. I think that the term that jumped out at me, racism, or the phrase, racism still rages on in a systemic way.
In a systemic way.
And you know that in this country, over the past week, there has been much discussion over that term, systemic racism, and a lot of people who struggle with being able to define it. How would you define systemic racism in Canada?
The thing is, do we have to come with a definition, or do we look at facts and realities? Okay? The constant demeaning, the constant harassment. I can speak from also the perspective of, just take, the National Black and Indigenous Summit organized by the Michaëlle Jean Foundation. We are in our 3rd edition right now. And what is happening? It's under the auspices of the UN very powerful call for an international decade for people of African descent on 3 values: recognition, justice, development, equity, the eradication of racial discrimination. The denial becomes part, of the problem. How can you address something if you're denying even the existence of the situation? You're denying, the voices speaking about the experience of constant racism.
So what do you think when the Premier of Quebec, Premier Legault, says systemic racism in Quebec does not exist?
How many surveys, studies, showed exactly the mechanism and the impact of, yes, systemic racism, which means that you find it in institutions, you find it, in businesses, you find it, in even academic institutions. It's how, people are judged on the color of their skin, or their ethnic or the ethnic backgrounds. It exists. I mean, I remember when I was interviewed, to work at Radio Canada, the CBC French network. The way the interview was conducted was very different. It was really conducted on the basis of my race. They were asking me, do you think you can really integrate? And on purpose, I forced that person to repeat that question several times because I just pretended I didn't understand. And at one point I asked, is there a problem with your teams? You're asking me all the time if I will be able to integrate. And all the previous interviews I had with other members of your program, it was all about my competences, my views on social issues, and you asking me if I can integrate. And then, he lost patience and he said, well, you have to realize you'll be the first Black person in the newsroom. So I stood and I said, you know what? I think we're going to stop that conversation right here. I think there's a problem, and I'm not a problem. The problem is on your side. You're talking about Premier Legault. He comes from the private sector. Hasn't he noticed that in some occasions boardrooms or events, bringing together the business community, sometimes there was probably one Black person in the room? Mm-hmm. Doesn't that speak loudly of a situation? I mean, and not taking the time to listen, not taking the time to even engage in a conversation, to share how people who are affected by it live it, is, I find, to an extent, very irresponsible.
He says he can still address racism. He's put together a working group. He wants to root it out. Mm-hmm. Can those measures adequately address the issue, the problem, if it can't be named, if it can't be identified?
It has to be named, it has to be identified. Denial is not helping. As I said, it becomes a part of the problem. I think you cannot actually adjust a situation, you cannot address a problem or a reality, a challenge, if you don't even take in consideration the people who are there, to make you understand what it feels like. It's a constant struggle.
That discussion is especially present right now in the world of policing, mm-hmm. and specifically in this country, a wide variety of them, but where the RCMP is concerned, especially with Indigenous mm-hmm. People in mm-hmm. this country. The RCMP's commissioner last week again said there were 15 to 20 definitions. She wasn't sure which one was the most accurate of systemic racism, and then a few days later admitted she should have said there was systemic racism in the RCMP.
We have to stop this discussion about the definition. Mm-hmm. I think we need to focus on realities lived, by so many people just because of their difference and the color of their skin and their ethnic, background. And I find that these people are experts of what they are living. They are experts of that reality. They are experts of that experience. So we need to listen to them, first and foremost. And within the police force, you'll have, people saying to you, yes, the bias exists. It exists. Mm-hmm. Why is it that sometimes a policeman, before a person who is Black feels that person is probably more dangerous, then shooting becomes, the immediate, response or excessive force.
Do you think the federal government is vigilant about what you just laid out? They're running, tomorrow we might find out if they secure a seat on the Security Council. Do you think that the action is there to back up what you just described?
You know what? When we say Black Lives Matter, when we say all lives matter, I think racism has to matter to all. It's not just, it's not a Black issue, mm-hmm. It's not an Aboriginal issue, it's not, racialized communities issue. It has to be something that matters to all of us. And for that, you know, I think as a society, Canada has this possibility of being even a better place and well considered, you know, in front of the I would say the international community, because of this courage that we have to consider that it's an unfinished business. We can always, you know, it's work in progress. There's always room for improvement. We recognize the problem. We're not in you know, a denial of the problem. It exists.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.